Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Spud Smart Roundtable Series webinar. My name is Madeline. I am the Director of Content with Seed World Group, and I have the pleasure of being your host today for this webinar. Moisture is the most universally challenging factor in potato production. There just never seems to be quite the right amount at the right time. In this roundtable webinar, we've invited 3 agronomy and production experts to talk about specific strategies potato producers can use to optimize short and long-term productivity, even when Mother Nature doesn't necessarily play along. So I'm just going to jump to our slides here. So we are tackling moisture that comes too much, too little, too late. Every single potato producer knows that feeling. And the specific things we're going to be digging into are, how do you build soils that can better handle that too much or too little moisture before it is too late? What are the real economics of soil resilience? How can we aim for quick wins, and where should the focus be for long-term benefit? What specific in-crop management practices can help producers weather challenging conditions? And what role might new varieties play? I am delighted to introduce the 3 speakers that we have today. I'm just going to switch slides here. There we go. So these are our 3 speakers. We have Amanda Crook. She is the lead agronomist for Western North America for McCain Foods. We have Susan Ainsworth, who is the general manager at the Keystone Potato Producers Association, and our cover model, our cover person from the spring edition of Spud Smart magazine. You might have seen her sitting atop a great big pile of spuds. And we have Cameron Ogilvie, and Cameron is the soil health educator for the Soil Health Institute. So thank you to all 3 for making time to speak with us today. Up first is Amanda. So I'm just going to introduce each person a little bit more just before they actually present. Our plan is that each person will present for about 10 minutes. And so that'll add up to 30-ish minutes of presentations, and then we will open the floor for questions. If you have questions, please type them into the comment box at any point in the presentation, and our plan is to answer the questions following the presentations. A recording of this webinar will be available on spudsmart.com within 48 hours. And I've included my email address there on the bottom of this slide. If you've got comments, follow-up questions, if hearing from these presenters inspires you to want to be a presenter on an upcoming Spud Smart webinar, I'd love to hear from you. So drop me a line anytime. So our first presenter, as I said, is Amanda Crook. Amanda is the lead agronomist for Western North America for McCain Foods. In her role, she oversees agronomic and sustainability improvements in Alberta, Manitoba, Washington, and Idaho. She works with McCain's local agronomists in each of these regions to offer variety management guidance, agronomic extension services, and support for McCain's farm partners adopting regenerative ag practices. Amanda has been in the potato industry for 13 years and with McCain Foods since 2022. She graduated from the University of Minnesota with a Bachelor of Science and North Dakota State University with a Master's of Science. Amanda will start us off today by digging into the relationship between soil, water, and plants, and she'll be providing some advice from McCain Foods' perspective. She'll also be talking a little bit about how the new variety pipeline can play a role in managing challenging moisture conditions. Thank you for being with us, Amanda.
Thanks, Madeline. So super excited to be speaking with you all today on such an important subject, that is moisture management. I live out in Western Canada, and already this year we've had interesting experiences with moisture this spring, both a combination of excessive rainfall during planting and also some limiting water restrictions in our irrigation districts. I'm thrilled to be presenting alongside Susan and Cam today. two awesome industry colleagues that I highly value and truly appreciate their knowledge and expertise. So let's jump into the first slide. I wanted to kick things off with a bit of a reminder of the basics on the water, soil, and plant relationship. So plant growth is dependent on a lot of things, but two major things, and that is soil and water. Soil provides the mechanical and nutrient support necessary for plant growth, and water is essential for those plant life processes. Of course, there are tons of resources online that go into great detail on this relationship, but I just wanted to highlight a few important aspects. For everyone that's on the call, something that we're probably all familiar with, but it's important to keep top of mind when talking about this relationship, is that texture dictates the water holding capacity of the soil, which in turn, it's kind of like a domino process, which in turn dictates how much water can be available for the plant to utilize. And that also in turn dictates your irrigation scheduling strategy. And that is if you have the ability to irrigate and don't rely just simply on natural rainfall to sustain your crop. So the irrigation strategy, scheduling strategy, is simply about when you're applying water and how much you're applying water, which is highly dependent on the plant growth stage and its water use requirements. So as you can see, it's a really complex relationship. Next slide. So I wanted to also start off by acknowledging that there are many factors that influences landowners' access to water. I've listed a few of them here. I'm certain this is not like a fully encompassing list. There's probably others that I've missed. But a few that I wanted to highlight are the ones that I think are having the largest impact today. One of them, it seems that regardless of your geographical location across North America, you have likely experienced some type of weather extreme influence your farming practice and production. Wildfires, excessive heat, like the heat dome we had in the West a few years ago, excessive moisture like the East experienced last fall, or drought conditions that we are currently managing through in the West. These are largely out of our control. They are out of our control. And as an industry, we are required to adapt quickly to these changing weather patterns in our area. Another one that I wanted to call out is land use changes. So as we see other industries enter into the potato growing regions, they are definitely causing competitive market for resources like land and water, which we are currently witnessing is putting a strain on our growers' access to those resources. Now let's invite the potato to the party. If I can go to the next slide here. So I'm certain everyone, must be familiar with the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? So like if for whatever reason you didn't hear that growing up, Goldilocks invites herself into the bear's cottage in the woods, and she sees three bowls of porridge sitting on the table, and she tries one, and oh, this one is too hot, and this one is too cold, and this one is just right. And I'm certain everyone can kind of look at that and go, oh, I can relate to that in some way or another. Well, I hate to be the one that calls out the potato, but the potato has a bit of a Goldilocks complex when it comes to water. We hear about it. The potato is very symptomatic when it is too much, and it is very symptomatic when it is too little. We are searching as producers, agronomists, anyone that is working in the field, that we're searching for that tight band of just right. And there are two main reasons why potatoes are the Goldilocks of agricultural crops, and that the first one is that it is a shallow rooted system, and the majority of the roots are concentrated in that first 12 inches of the soil profile. And second is that we know when provided adequate water, potatoes perform very well in light soil texture with high percent sand, which, as we know, has the lowest water holding capacity. So it definitely is that Goldilocks character in this storyline. And next slide. So far we've reviewed the basics of the water, soil, and plant relationship. We've discussed how most of our access or limitations to water are actually out of our control. And we've also acknowledged that we're in the industry, we're growing a crop, the potato, that is highly sensitive to water stress. And maybe my side comment is it's a good thing that folks that do work in the potato industry have grit, because you definitely need it when you're faced with all of these challenges. So just to pivot a little bit to some advice from your trusted processing partner on what you can do when you are experiencing too much or too little water during your growing season. The next couple of slides may be old information to some of our potato veterans out there, but it is still a great reminder or a resource for those that are new to the industry. So we're going to start with too much. Obviously, it depends on the time of the year when you are experiencing too much moisture, but it is important to consider the conditions of the field prior to doing any sort of field activity like tillage, planting, or harvesting. Consequences of completing field activities when the soil is saturated could have long-term impacts on your field and soil health that you will have to manage through for many, many years afterwards. So it is best to hold back and wait until the field is fit for those type of activities. Another thing to consider when having a season of too much moisture is the risk to your crop inputs and your crop protection products. So breakdown or movement of some of these water-soluble inputs out of the target soil profile can leave your crop at risk of increased disease potential or early plant senescence, which in turn can influence your ability to store your crop or receive prime payable yields. So when stuff like that happens, it's important to have conversations with your agronomist or a McCain representative. The biggest factor to success in this case, when it is too much moisture, is definitely to increase your communication efforts with your McCain, whether it's the agronomist, the field rep, or the scheduler. We can assist in best management practice decisions and appropriately deliver your raw into the factory to help mitigate any on-farm challenges. So a real life example from our eastern growing region last year, they experienced excessive rainfall that resulted in storages that had up to 30% hollow heart. Again, this isn't something that was within our control. It's Mother Nature. That was just the cards that were dealt. But ensuring constant and consistent communication of the challenges that you are experiencing to the regional field teams has been truly critical in managing the defect in storage and making sure that your raw is getting delivered to the factory. So now pivoting to the scenario when you're experiencing a growing season with too little moisture. If we can advance to the next slide, thanks. There are obviously similar challenges to achieving prime payables in this scenario as well. If the crop is suffering from drought stress, it may result in an earlier than normal senescence, which in turn would result in a smaller tuber profile. That being said, in the West, going into a bit of a drought year, McCain does want to emphasize to prioritize quality of potatoes over quantity of potatoes. Of course, we all know that having the correct amount of moisture available to the potatoes through each of the growth stage is critical for ideal crop development, hence this Goldilocks complex, like we want to hit that just right at all points of the year. However, if there was one phase of crop development that is the most important, if there was a hierarchy to access moisture, it would be at tuber initiation. So the early season moisture plays a key role in ensuring peak quality. Water stress during this time of year, stolonization and tuber set can reduce tuber numbers per plant, result in yield reduction, increase in misshape in potatoes, potentially leading to sugar ends and poor processing abilities. Another thing to consider when facing a drought year is field selection. So I know this isn't a strategy that you can implement for this growing season given the time of the year, but it's something perhaps to consider in your future. When developing your crop rotation across your land, prioritizing your high potential fields for potato production, whether that looks like selecting fields with higher organic matter or heavier soil texture to ensure that higher water holding capacity. A field that has high resilience to perform, even in a drought year, may be a winning approach to achieving both quality and yield. And a real life example in this situation, of course, is in the West this year. So the largest irrigation district in Alberta has recently announced an allocation of 8 inches of water per acre for the land in that district. And this isn't a situation that we've experienced before. So at McCain, we have decided that this year is going to be a data collection year for us. We have invested in and will be deploying a collection of soil moisture monitors across the Southern Alberta region. installing them in variation of soil textures, different potato varieties, different irrigation districts to attempt to collect as much information as possible on how effective we are at managing the water needs of the crop under such water restrictions. And this will help us develop best management practice guidelines for the future. Next slide, please. So if you are a McCain potato grower, you are probably already very familiar with all of this information here. And for those that aren't, McCain believes that regenerative agriculture must be at the core of the way that we grow food. Challenges are inherent in all regions and all seasons, but the key to success lies in the proactive management our growers do. We believe sustainable practices need to be both economical and environmentally viable. At the end of the day, it's all about assuring supply, achieving our yield targets, and investing in building resilient soils. The QR code on the screen, if you wanted to snap a picture right now with your phone, will take you directly to our recently updated regenerative ag framework with all of the details and explanations of the indicators there. There are a number of the regen ag indicators on the framework that, if you chose to focus on, would help to build resilient soils that in turn will help through excessive moisture or drought years. A couple include, armoring your soil with cover crops, minimizing soil disturbance, enhancing farm and ecosystem biodiversity, and increasing your soil's organic matter. So these are some things that that Cam will cover in his portion of the presentation. Okay, so if we can't control the weather, perhaps we can focus on something that is within our control, which is the varieties we plant. Next slide, please. So the development and adoption of new varieties is critical for maintaining supply of potatoes. There is no one variety that will solve all of North American challenges. And similar to a financial portfolio, we need to diversify the risks with multiple varieties. Customers are increasingly engaged in conversations around varieties and the importance of flexibility to assure supply for the long term. There is a need for climate-resistant varieties to continue to deliver the volume and quality that the customers expect, and we believe we have those varieties. They have plasticity, heat stress tolerance, and more. McCain's widely shared goal for 2030 is to replace most of the standard varieties that have been grown for many years and to move into the adoption of new varieties that will drastically reduce nitrogen inputs, improve water use efficiencies, and improved yield. They also may have the ability, with some of these varieties that are shorter season, creating opportunities for example, cover cropping or reduced water needs to grow that crop. Some of the growers that have experience with these new varieties so far have been reporting between a 5 and a 10% reduction in irrigation use with their couple years of experience. And I think at the bottom line of all this, with the new varieties and the regenerative ag strategies, is supply assurance. Okay, so last slide here. So to wrap this up, then before I hand it over to Susan to share her experience with tackling moisture challenges, I offer this formula, propose this formula to successfully managing water challenges in the future. So I do think that if we focus on building resilient soils on the farm, if we adopt new varieties with increased water use efficiencies and efficiencies all around, input efficiencies, continue to provide extension services like this webinar or any on-farm research or any sort of grower education, if we continue to invest in technology that advances our management of these water resources, that this would be one piece of the puzzle that results in assured supply for our market. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Such useful information. And I also should just say a huge thank you and a high five to McCain Foods for being our sponsor of today's webinar. It's great to partner with you. I am going to just, there we go. Add Susan here. Susan, thank you so much for being with us. I'm just going to introduce you. I did briefly say that you were that you are a well-known face in the industry. You've been in the industry for a long time, and you are an even more well-known face now that you are the cover of our spring edition. Susan is an agrologist and the still relatively new general manager of Keystone Potato Producers Association. I think, have you been there now for almost a year?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. Which, of course, Keystone Potato Producers represents processed potato growers in Manitoba. Susan has worked in the potato industry in Manitoba for the past 27 years. She says what keeps her in this industry is her passion for working with producers to help advance their productivity, profitability, and sustainability. I keep saying she, I should be saying you, Susan. You have a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Manitoba and an MBA from Shannon School of Business at Cape Breton University. You are also the owner of Stolen Glance Agronomy Limited. Susan, your plan today is to talk about the economics of moisture, exactly how too little or too much impacts a grower's bottom line, and why it's so important to build resilience into soil. As always, it's such a pleasure to chat with you. Let me just bring up your presentation here.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Madeline. And thanks for the opportunity to be able to speak today with Cam and Amanda. Greatly appreciated. And this is certainly an important topic. And I think Amanda did a great job in sort of setting the stage of why this is so important and why potato is maybe, I like how she used the term Goldilocks, because it is a very shallow rooted crop, which makes it more susceptible to these moisture fluctuations. So when we talk about the economics, water is really either directly or indirectly a part of everything, or all the attributes that growers are financially compensated for. And so she also made mention of quantity over quality. And I want to talk about that a little bit more too. So obviously yield, we tend to think of as the big driver, but in potatoes, as most of you know, quality is equally, if not more important in some cases. So size profile, specific gravity, fry color, sugar ends, bruising, hollow heart, rot, these are all the attributes that the growers are compensated for on their contracts. And what I want to talk about when we sort of look at how moisture impacts these things. And in addition, how moisture indirectly through either altering the soil temperature, because it can obviously cool it through evaporative cooling, and also through some of the implications that it has with fertility. So moisture can have, again, direct impacts or indirect impacts to some of these quality attributes. So I'm going to tell the story with a bunch of pictures that I've sort of collected over the years, because I think sometimes the saying is true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So let's hop into it. The first slide we'll talk about is sort of too little. So again, Amanda did a great job of talking about the importance of moisture early. And so again, I want to reiterate that. This point of tuber initiation. So you can see in the one photo there, initiation is really when those hooks start to swell and you get those little tubers starting to form. This is when you know this is a really critical time for soil moisture in potato. And on the bottom there, you'll see it goes hand in hand again, soil moisture with soil temperature. So if you have high temperatures in your growing season at this point in your growth stage of your potato crop, you want to ensure it just makes soil moisture maintenance that much more important. So we can see a plant there that's under some stress where the stolons are extending out and starting to run instead of producing a tuber at the end of it. So I've sort of put a comparative plant side by side there of what it should look like versus a plant where the stolons are starting to run. That obviously is going to impact yield, but also your profile size and uniformity. So this is when the plant is determining how many tubers to produce. So you can see on the bottom right there, a plant that was not under stress at that time of tuber initiation, where you've got a good set, and then a plant that has a much lower set as a result of having some stress. Now, one thing I want to spend a little bit more time on and attention to is sugar ends, because this is a really important one. And this is where the quantity over quality comes in. If you produce a crop that the processors struggle to process, it doesn't matter what your yield is. If you're not able to haul that when you want to haul, or put that into a SKU that the processor is running, it's going to give you all kinds of problems. And so this is why Amanda is referring to, if you are restricted in the amount of water that you can use in a season, make sure that you're putting it up front where it's going to have the most impact on some of these quality issues. So from a physiological standpoint, what's happening with the sugar end is, obviously in a plant, the leaves through photosynthesis are creating sucrose. That sucrose is translocated down to the tuber, where it's converted to starch under normal conditions. If you have stress at this time of tuber initiation, what's happening is the enzymes that are responsible for that conversion of sucrose into starch are damaged, and the cell function actually changes. And so the sucrose either stays as a simple sugar, or it's further reduced into glucose and fructose. And those reducing sugars are what causes that fry to fry dark at the end. And so if you're digging up potatoes at this tuber initiation time and you start to see some of those really small tubers, so really the critical time is when those tubers are dime size to an egg size. If they start to look pointy, you know that they have undergone some stress. So the critical threshold for soil moisture to avoid this happening is staying above 65%. So really 55 to 65, in that range is when you're going to see problems. And it really only takes a single stress event for this to occur. So I have one really ugly picture up there. This was just a plant that was planted outside the span of the pivot. So you can see how critical it is when you don't have any moisture on some of these coarse textured sands. It's critical to have moisture there. Otherwise, you get these quality issues. So number one, we want to make sure we set the plant up with a decent set. Number two, we want to ensure that the quality is there. And once you have created that damage or sugar end in that tuber, you can't overcome that with proper management later in the season. And lastly, there's a slide on the top right. Low moisture at initiation or early season can also be a contributing factor to common scab. So something to keep in mind. There are these other sort of complex situations where it's having an impact on other pathogens as well. And maybe that's a good lead into the next slide, where we talk about too much moisture. So again, this is the extreme. So we talked about too dry. If we look at too much moisture, or if we're in a situation where we have saturated soil, I've shown a picture there where we've got water sitting in a wheel track of a pivot. Those situations where you have saturated soil, you'll get a tuber that's the picture immediately adjacent to it where the lenticels are wide open. So the lenticels obviously being the part of that tuber where gas exchange occurs, or the ability for that tuber to breathe. So when that's impeded by saturated soil conditions, those lenticels have to swell. They're trying to increase their surface area for gas exchange. The problem with this is when that happens, that's opening that tuber up to infection with soft rot. This is one of the reasons why we say if you've had moisture or water that's been sitting in an area of your field, make sure that you don't harvest that. So even if at harvest time that water is gone and you're able to pull the digger through there, you may not want to if you had water laying there earlier, because you would have had a situation like this potentially, where you may be harvesting tubers that have this soft rot infection. So the picture on the far right top is almost the worst case scenario in my mind, which is where you've had this infection happen, but the tuber has stayed intact. You've been able to harvest it. And now the issue is that you're probably going to put that into storage where it can cause you some serious storage losses. So I've got some pictures of obviously some soft rot, pythium, pink rot. Those are really detrimental to put into your storages, obviously going to have a huge impact. Also want to talk about just having excess moisture and having that additional moisture in the canopy and what that does from a pathogen standpoint. So it can increase the incidence of white mold, of gray mold, or botrytis. And anytime you have some of those stem infections, if that takes out those stems, it's also limiting the supply of that sucrose moving, and all of the tubers that are associated with that stem are no longer able to bulk. And then lastly, this is the extreme again. We talked about hurting or increasing the incidence of common scab if you're too light on moisture early. If you have excess moisture early, you can increase the incidence of powdery scab. And powdery scab is the pathogen that's associated or a vector for mop top virus, which we're seeing more and more. So this is an important one to keep your eye out for. Certainly there's other soil-borne pathogens that can be influenced by excess moisture early in the growing season as well. So all kinds of reasons that will have a very direct economic impact if we have too much soil moisture. And lastly, I just want to talk about what happens when you fluctuate back and forth between these two extremes. So you'll notice in the first photo there, again, the majority of the varieties that we're growing is Russet Burbank being indeterminate. If you go through a area of stress at initiation, you can see there was the first set, there is a little bit of misshapen tubers there, and then the conditions sort of recover to more ideal, you'll get a second set. This is where you start to have, again, issues with quality. Your specific gravity is going to be different. The maturity of those tubers is going to be different. You'll also start to see knobs or where the eyes have blown out. Again, this is just where you have abrupt changes in tuber growth rate. And when growth resumes, it's happening at the areas of most active cell growth, which is those meristem areas or around the eyes. So that's why you'll start to see these tubers that blow their eyes and end up becoming knobs. Now, at the same time, this is exactly the same conditions that cause hollow heart. So any abrupt change in that tuber growth rate is going to cause, again, knobs. And usually if you have a tuber that has those misshapen or knobs on them, you'll have hollow heart. Not always, but in lots of cases, that's true. And usually the conditions that contribute to this is when you have a lack of water followed by this abundance of water. So again, Amanda sort of talked about, it's difficult for us to manage this because in most cases, this is a weather event. And again, last picture there showing when you had in that first photo, I showed some of those stolons that start to run. They can create chain tubers later. Those tubers are never going to fill as efficiently as a tuber that is resulted or been created the way it should be at the end of a stolon. So really, again, having these conditions fluctuate is not ideal either. And very difficult, again, with a potato crop that's shallow rooted to maintain kind of that consistent, just right type condition. So that being said, I think I'm excited to hear what Cam has to say, because I think there are ways that we can build some resilience into our soil to help better buffer some of these fluctuations and to help be able to maintain soil moisture at that just right level. So with that, I'll pass it over to Cam.
Thank you so much, Susan. Your 27 years of knowledge and experience in this industry were very, very evident in that presentation. We sure appreciate your knowledge and expertise. Let me just introduce Cam here. Just give me a second. Perfect. So we are excited and grateful to have all three of our speakers, but I feel like Cam deserves a special shout out today. He is just a few hours away from becoming a dad for the second time, Cam? Third time. And I feel that we need to give you a high five through the computer for...
Well, my wife. I don't have much involved in this process, so...
Well, we sure appreciate you prioritizing being with us, and give a big high five to your wife from us for allowing you to spend a few minutes with us. It is extremely appreciated. So Cam Ogilvie. Cam is the soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute, which, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is a global nonprofit with a mission to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils through scientific research and advancement. Cam leads the soil health education program for farmers, agronomists, and food companies as they work to implement profitable, resilient, climate-smart, regenerative soil management systems. He has a MSc in cropping systems and agronomy from the University of Guelph, where he studied the on-farm impacts of cover crops, which you, I think, prefer to call service crops, Cam, on water and nutrient cycling. So Cam's plan is to follow up on Susan's discussion of economics, outlining a long view of soil and how to make the most of water. Specifically, I think, Cam, you'll be digging into how to help soil maximize what you call CASH. For anyone who hasn't heard that acronym before, that is capture, access, store, and hold for moisture. Let me just bring in your presentation here.
Sure. Thanks so much, Madeline. Yeah, so I'm kind of picking up where Susan and Amanda left off. You know, there's a saying that the best time to plant a tree was, 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. So that's really what I'm focusing on here is, Susan and Amanda kind of covered what can you do this year to deal with too much or too little. And I'm kind of looking at the long view. And so this is my long-term cash strategy for you. How do we capture water? How do we help plants access water? How do we store it and hold on to it in the soil? And so that I'm going to walk you through a couple of picture examples of this here. First off, capturing water. What you're looking at here is a picture of a rainfall simulator. So if you've never seen one of these before, what we do is we go out to the field and we collect some pans of soil. We try to keep them intact as much as possible. And then we put them under a sprinkler and we let it rain for a minute or so. And so you can see there's two rows of buckets there. The front ones are capturing runoff, the water that hits the top of those pans and then runs off of the front. And the back row of buckets is capturing infiltration. And what you should be able to see is that the three pans on the right with living plants there or crop residues on the surface, there is next to no runoff on those soils. All of that water is being captured. It's moving into the soil. And the reason for that is because when that rain hits the soil surface, it's got a lot of impact to it. And it can break apart the soil structure. And when it does that, it starts to fill in the pores that exist in your soil, those macro pore channels that move water down in. That soil will fill it in, the surface seals, and you get runoff. And so this, I think, is a really important principle. Keeping the soil covered provides some nice protection to enhance water capture. But there's other things that contribute to water capture as well. What you are seeing here is a clod of soil that I took from a wheat field that was following an alfalfa crop, and it's going to potatoes next year. And what you're looking at in the center there is a macropore channel left over from an alfalfa root. So as that alfalfa root was decomposing, being broken down by the organisms in the soil, it left this beautiful channel that's really going to help to capture, get that water into the soil. But I hope what you can see as well is not just those large channels, but there's a really nice mix of different sized pores there. You've got some medium-sized pores, some micropores. You've got some earthworm frass that you see there, or you can see the activity that's been going on from the different soil organisms that are there. All of that is going to also be a key part of being able to eventually store and hold on to that water and allow that water to move through. So the only way that we get this is if we don't disturb the soil. If we till the soil pretty intensively, we remove all those pores, we disconnect them, and so no longer are they able to bring water into the soil. It can't move through the soil profile when those pore channels, when that structure has been disturbed. So that's about capturing water. When I think about accessing water, this is one of the first things I go to. These are telltale signs of soil compaction. So if you take a shovel full of soil from your field and you open it up like you would open a book, you want your soil to kind of fracture randomly, kind of like a chocolate cake. But when you open it up and you start seeing these horizontal fracture lines, that is a telltale sign of compaction. And one of the things that comes along with it is, in this picture on the right, you may be able to see the plant roots here are growing horizontally along that fracture plate. And that's not ideal for water capture, for plants to be able to access water. Plants like to access water through their fine roots within the soil matrix, not along these compacted layers. So in order for that root to be able to do that, it's got to punch through that compacted layer. And right now it's just taking the path of least resistance and moving horizontally. So that's another sign that you might have some limited access to water there. One of the ways that you can kind of combat that is by trying to get as many roots growing in that soil as you can to bust up that compaction. You know, tillage can be a two-edged sword. It can be used to alleviate compaction, but then often what it does is it ends up creating a compacted layer just below wherever that implement was set to, whatever the depth was, or because it's removed a bunch of the soil structure, then it leaves the soil that much more prone to be compacted afterwards. So if you're going to do like a targeted subsoil kind of to remove compaction, get some living roots in there as soon as possible so that they can fill up those cracks, fill up those gaps, and start building some structure into that soil. You can see different types of plants have different root systems. On the left, there's sunflower and turnip and phacelia. They've got more of a taproot, really good and strong for being able to bust through compacted layers. In the middle, you've got millet and oats, more fine-rooted grasses that help to aggregate soils, build structure, build more of those medium-sized pores in the soil. And on the right, of course, some nice benefits that you get from adding legumes into a mix like this. You get a little bit of nitrogen fixed, can offset some fertilizer a little bit. So lots of nice benefits from different plants. And so you can get some payoffs from having a diversity of plants, but particularly getting cover crops and perennials into the rotation can really help to bust up compaction and improve water access. Before I talk about storing and holding water, I want to just share a little bit about a project that we did to evaluate soil health measurements across North America. And so we went to 124 long-term experiments comparing soil health management practices. So think of full moldboard plow to no tillage. Think of compost and manure applications to no organic amendments added. Cover crops to no cover crops. These are the types of experiments here. And we took soils from all the different plots and we ran over 30 different soil health tests on them. I want to show you data from water holding capacity from this side of things. So what you're seeing in these graphs is the change in field capacity moisture. Field capacity is the amount of water that is held in your soil after what can drain freely from gravity has been removed. So you could also think about this like your bathtub. You've got an overflow hole on your bathtub, and so when it's full up, all the water that's freely drained is gone, and so there's still a little bit of a gap from the top of the tub. It's not overflowing. So that's what field capacity is kind of like. And you are looking at the change in that based on different practices, keeping crop residues in the system, cover crops, organic amendments, reducing tillage. There's two ways you can measure this. One of them is using repacked cores. We go to the field, we collect a soil core, we bring it back to the lab, we unpack it, and we repack it again, and then we measure field capacity on that. This really shows the impact of texture, but as you can see here, there's no real benefit from these management practices on field capacity if you measure it that way. So these practices have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years, and when you've removed all the structure, there's no change in field capacity. However, when you use intact cores where the structure is in place, now all of a sudden, we can store more water. We have more water holding capacity in these soils when we're keeping crop residues in the system, applying organic amendments, and reducing tillage, reducing how much soil disturbance takes place. Why is this relevant to potato production? Well, I think this makes the case for why we should try to minimize how much we till the soil as much as possible going into the potato crop. I know there's a lot of preparation that tends to happen, but what this is showing is the more you break down the good structure you've built up throughout your crop rotation, the more you break that down going into your potato crop, the less you're going to see the benefits of that good soil structure that you've worked so hard to achieve. So trying to minimize disturbance is really, really key to being able to increase the amount of water that you can hold on to. I think this is another really great point for why you shouldn't just look at one soil health indicator. A lot of times we talk about the importance of organic matter for holding water in soils, and that's true, but here's soil structure. This is a really important part of the picture as well. And so this is why at the Institute, we actually recommend a suite of soil health measurements. We look at soil organic carbon. So that's just the carbon fraction of organic matter. Carbon mineralization potential is a measure of microbial activity. And then aggregate stability is a great measure of soil structure. And we love it because you can do it yourself using your smartphone. So there's a Slakes app that you can get from wherever you get your apps. And it's measuring what you're seeing in the video right now. When you expose soil to water, it will either hold together because it has good structure, like the clod of soil you see on the left, or it's going to slake and break apart, like the soil that you see on the right. The soil on the left is not compacted. It has good structure, and so when it gets exposed to water, the water is not bursting it apart. It's holding together. What that looks like in the field is something like this. This is a slump test. So what I did is I went and I took large clods of soil from a field that's long-term fallow. So you got to imagine it's got living roots, it's fully covered, and it hasn't been disturbed in years. All kind of ideal conditions as far as soil health and water holding capacity is concerned. I took a big clod of that and I put it in a basket. And I did the same from a field that was in grain this year, but it's in a potato grain rotation in Maine. These are the same soil type, but they've been managed differently. And so when you submerge these in water, let them sit for a minute or two, they get fully soaked, and then you dump them out on the table and you see what happens. On the right, where that soil's been heavily disturbed, there's not a lot of good structure in place, not a lot of good roots to hold that together. It collapses. And this shows you the challenges that you run into with waterlogging, overly saturated soils. When these soils that don't have good structure get exposed to water, what's there collapses. It leaves that soil much more prone to low oxygen environment, leaves it much more prone to compaction. You may end up with some different harvest issues. I know a lot of growers often point out, well, I'm not sure I want to dig potatoes out of a field that's got tons of roots in it. And so there's challenges there too. But I think this just illustrates the benefits to having that good soil structure there to be able to handle the water you've got, that your storage for water doesn't collapse on you once your field gets wet. So that's what I've got for now. Looking forward to continuing the discussion with Susan and Amanda.
Perfect. Thank you, Cam. I so appreciate your knowledge there. That wraps up the formal presentation part of today's webinar. We're going to open the floor to questions, and we're just going to add Amanda and Susan back in so that we can have a chat. If you are a live viewer and you've got a question for any or all of our presenters, feel free to type it into the chat box there. You can either name an individual, or hopefully our speakers can just kind of jump in on the answering of questions. Just before we jump to the questions, I want to again mention that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at spudsmart.com following this live event. Generally takes 24 to 48 hours for the recording to be available. I think that the speakers have provided such involved and detailed information that many people who are watching live will probably even want to go back and have another look at some of the slides and your comments. So we will just turn the floor over here to the questions. So the first question comes from Diego, and I will read it out loud. What is the most accurate and affordable way to monitor soil moisture? Aerial imagery, soil sensors, a combination of them? Who wants to jump in and take a stab at this one?
I can.
Okay.
And if anyone wants to add anything afterwards, feel free.
Perfect.
So I think my comment would be nothing beats having like the intimate knowledge of knowing your field personally, and the soil type and the soil texture, and going out there and physically feeling the soil with your hand. There will be no technology that can replace that farmer's perspective. I do think like McCain's invested in some of these technologies that Diego has listed, and I think that those do provide some added value. And I would say that if you had a combination of all of them, that would be a great solution. But again, I wouldn't put a soil sensor into the field and then never yourself go to the field to check out the soil moisture.
Excellent.
The other thing I'd add to it is that there's different types of soil moisture sensors. So you can measure volumetric water content. So think the amount of water, the volume of it in the soil profile. Or you can measure water potential, which is the pull on water in the soil. If you think about a straw or a graduated cylinder, you see the water kind of pull up on the edges. That's because water has a little bit of a chemical pull on itself. And so that's how water gets held in soil pores. And if you just measure volumetric water content, it doesn't actually tell you how much is available to the plants. That's actually more related to how tightly held that water is in soil. And so I think there's even been if I've got my knowledge right, I think there's even been a transition towards more water potential based sensors for irrigation monitoring. So that's all that I'd add there.
Perfect. Susan, do you want to add to that at all?
Nothing to really add. I agree with Amanda. I think nothing really replaces that connection that a farm has with their own soil, and nothing will really replace putting your hands in the dirt. I think there's a place for technology, and but not as a replacement for being out in your field. Perfect.
Okay. I've received a few texted questions that won't come up on the screen here. So let me just read to you. Growing season stress, whether we're talking too much or too little moisture, translates to physiologically old potatoes, and obviously impacts storability. How much do growers need to keep managing a stored crop differently if kind of thinking back through the season to if it was dealing with moisture stress early in the season, mid-season, late season?
I think this really depends on what's the status of your crop is at the time that you put it into storage. If you've had too much moisture and you're worried about soft dry, you're going to manage your storage accordingly. If you've had reduced moisture that's had an impact on the maturity of your crop and you're worried about fry color, for example, hopefully you know that, do some sugar testing prior to harvest, and then again, store that accordingly. So again, I think because moisture can have all of these impacts on your crop, the important piece is having a good understanding of the quality of your crop that you're putting into the bin, and then managing that accordingly. Physiological aging from that stress, we tend to think about more on a seed standpoint versus a processing crop standpoint. But no, it's absolutely critical to know the health of the crop that you're putting into your bin for sure.
Amanda, do you want to add anything from a processor standpoint?
Maybe just to reemphasize the whole communications effort. So if you have any concerns, the examples that Susan just laid out, to make sure that you're communicating that as early as you can, or even pre-harvest if you have concerns with your McCain field rep and scheduler, just so that we don't want anyone to sit on potatoes that are melting without our knowledge. So that way we can help mitigate some of that risk for you on farm.
Excellent. Cam, I've got a kind of bigger industry-wide question for you. Cover crops, reduced tillage, we've been talking these things for multiple years. How much of a shift are you seeing in the industry in terms of uptake of these soil structure supporting tools or techniques?
Good question. I think it goes in waves. Like there was a big wave back in the early 90s, and then there was a big wave in the early 2000s, and then I think we're in another wave right now. I've heard there's lots of different reasons for that. Some of it is government funding for incentive programs and things like that. Some of it has to do with commodity prices. And when commodity prices are high, people have more margin to spend on some of these things, some of these extra inputs. I think no-till is generally increasing for crops that can be managed that way. There's time and cost savings associated with that. I don't think that's going anywhere. Cover crops, are a two-edged sword for water. They take water as well, and so I know some growers who've used cover crops for years who are, really humming and hawing about what am I going to do this year because I got to manage my water pretty carefully. So we'll just see. I think a lot of these things are here to stay. There's been some great surveys that have come out of University of Manitoba looking at cover crop use across the prairies, and that's, I think, going in a positive direction as well.
Susan, could you add to that? What are you seeing amongst your producers?
Oh, I agree with Cam 100%. I think it's dependent on farm. I think his comment on moisture is an important one. So, and dependent on whether or not your cover crop is replacing a cash crop, so a full season cash crop, or whether you're utilizing a cover crop in the shoulder season. And so producers' ability to be able to irrigate in those rotational years makes a big difference to whether or not a cover crop is a fit for the farm or not. And also what crops they're growing in their rotation, and is there enough of a shoulder season to get something established? And if you do get something established, what do you choose? Do you choose something that can overwinter that then is going to utilize soil moisture in the spring? Or do you want to use something that winter kills that then can save some of that early spring moisture for whatever crop you're growing? So I think there's a lot of different factors that need to be considered. And that's where Cam's saying, it can be a double-edged sword. And I think that's an important consideration, that some of these practices are not just a given fit for every farm. Each individual farm really needs to look and figure out their own needs and what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and then choose the appropriate practice to achieve what it is that they want for an outcome. Yep.
It requires adaptation. We talk a lot about adoption, like, you just start one day, and I don't think that's anybody's experience. You pick something up and then you got to adapt it. It takes years. You iterate.
Amanda, do you want to add from a processor perspective what McCain Foods is doing in order to encourage uptake?
Yeah, so we've definitely had a big emphasis on our extension services in this area. Of course, McCain has our Farm of the Future locations, the one in New Brunswick, where they're producing potatoes using only regenerative practices. And then we've also, this last summer 2023, kicked off our Innovation Hubs concept, which is taking the Farm of the Future concept, but bringing it into region. So it's more of a regional related situation. And we're looking at things like, cover cropping, reducing EIQ chemistries applied to the field, looking at new varieties, for our nutrient management strategies, reducing tillage, you can go on and on. Basically, every indicator that's on the McCain framework is something that we're focusing on within all of our production regions across North America. So it's really what we're trying to do is provide a little bit of risk mitigation for those farmers that we've partnered with in these Innovation Hub Farm projects, and really just trying to make sure that it's regionally relatable for the growers in that area. So they have an example of how this transition could potentially work for them.
Perfect. I'm seeing a timer on my screen saying that we just passed the 1 hour mark. And I always try to tell all of our viewers that we'll keep it to an hour. So I feel like we could continue chatting for at least another hour on this very important topic. I just want to follow up with one quick question for you, Cam. One of our viewers asked if you could go a little bit deeper about the use of Slake.
Explain that a bit more. Okay, so it's a phone app, and the way that it works is you can go and download the app, and what it's going to ask you to do is you take a new sample. It's going to give you some instructions. You create a sample ID on there, and then it's going to give you kind of a viewfinder, and you're going to want to set this up on a stand so that it's not going to move. And then you're going to have some kind of plate underneath it. That plate you're going to start out with that plate empty, and then you're going to add your aggregates in. You'll take a picture with the app. Then you're going to add some water to that plate. You'll take another picture, and it's going to start a 10-minute timer. And then it'll take a before and after picture of before at the start and after at the 10-minute mark. And it's going to measure how much those aggregates slaked or spread apart in that time. And it'll give you an index there. The higher the index, the more stable and better structured that soil is. Now, this is, of course, going to depend on your texture. So it's actually the opposite of what you might expect. Sandy soils don't slake very much. They kind of just slump in place. And so sandy soils tend to have higher index values. Clay soils slake more. So if you're going to do this comparison on one of your fields, you really want to find two fields that are the same soil type, same texture, but maybe have been managed differently. And then you can start comparing, what does the aggregate stability like of these two soils.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you for that. I feel sad to end this conversation, I have to say, because I really think that there are so many more good questions to ask. Thank you to each and every one of you for making time. We are enormously appreciative, and I hope and also have confidence that the information that you provided to farmers today was really useful and will impact how they move forward through this season and beyond. So your time and your knowledge is very, very appreciated. To our viewers, thank you for making time to join us. We are excited to bring you this kind of useful agronomic information. I want to also just do a final thanks to McCain Foods for sponsoring today's conversation. If you have additional questions about this webinar, or you'd like to share comments about the webinar, we always love to hear from you. So just reach out to SpudSmart, and we are keen to continue this conversation. Again, a recording of the webinar will be available on spudsmart.com in about 48 hours. Thanks to all. Have a super day.